We are on page 448 of Savitri, the Book of Fate. The turning point of the story, as it were. It's interesting that man wants to change his fate, wants to know his fate. But paradoxically, at least that's what the stories tell us, when he knows his fate, all his actions inevitably, it seems, draws it closer. And it's beautifully demonstrated in the Greek myth of Oedipus and the king of Thebes. So it is foretold. It's very similar. These stories are very similar. In Indian context, it is Kansa who hears Akashvani that you are going to be killed by your own nephew. And he tries every which way to ward it off. But everything that he does, strangely, brings it closer and closer to his destiny. Same thing we find in this story, this Greek legend, and that's why they are Greek tragedies, not just because of the tragic end. But the end becomes doubly tragic that after knowing what is going to happen, everything that he does actually makes the event come closer and closer. So the king knows that his son is going to, there is a prophecy that his son is going to kill him when he grows up. Now, probably if he had done nothing and brought up the child with love and care, it's very unlikely that the child would have grown up and actually killed his father. But he is seized with fear that he is going to kill me. So he sends the child away along with few henchmen who should kill the child. And sure enough, one of the henchmen has some kind of a sympathy and he abandons the child and comes back, says he has been killed. And this child grows up now alienated from his father. So he doesn't know who his father is and the father doesn't know who the son is. And so as the story goes and the drama unfolds, eventually they are face to face in a mortal combat. And since they don't know that they are father and son, they end up fighting a deadly mortal combat where the father is killed by the son. The solution may have been very, very simple, just to bring up the child with a lot of love and care. It doesn't work out. Same thing we see in many of Narada's prophecies. There are several instances of Narada's prophecies. Particularly, he has a penchant for going to the Asuras and telling them, you know what, this is going to happen. And after that, every action and deed is as if it draws the destiny near. It's very strange. But not so strange if we understand the dynamics of fate. What we normally believe is that if we can change outer situations, we can change destiny. And there are very funny examples of that. The mother speaks of it once with regard to a man who was told that he will die of drowning in the sea. So this man never went to the sea and said, very fine, I won't die. So he died of a fish bone getting stuck in his throat when he was eating the fish. Now this is strange. Eventually he died of drowning not exactly in the sea, but in some way or the other, the sea became the cause of his death. He was literally choked to death. And we know the sea fish probably contains something of the sea inside it. So it's very strange that we try to change situations. And every time we change the situation, it brings us closer and closer to the event which is decreed. So Savitri has this knowledge. And so when Savitri says, I have made my choice and I'll go through it, it's a very wise choice. Though to her mother it looks like a hot-headed choice. You know, this man is going to die. Why don't you simply change the husband? That's the simplest way. But Savitri makes a different choice. She knows that by changing situations, I cannot avoid my destiny. It will come again and again in some form or the other. It will mirror and reflect. So she makes another choice, and that choice also we can make. It is to go through a situation, but from a changed state of consciousness. That is the secret. That a situation and circumstance is the result of an inner state of consciousness. And that's where we have the key. And Savitri legend almost gives us the key. Fate, situations, circumstances are nothing but a clumsy way to reflect an inner condition. Mother says sometimes we find our life in a mess. It's a state of chaos, not just the drawers which Mother has spoken of, but life. And it means there is somewhere within us some kind of a contradiction, some kind of a inner chaos, which is manifesting as chaos in outer life. And if we try to sort it out outwardly by running away or trying to, simply change things outwardly, it doesn't work out. So we have to sort this chaos and this mess inside, and that's a difficult process. It's not easy because to sort it out, we have to change the state of consciousness, and that is the big challenge. So this is one aspect which Savitri reveals, and I think it's a great revelation. It also answers this frequent charge that is leveled against Indian thought, that it is fatalistic. Well, Greek thought is fatalistic. All the stories of fate in Greek thought are fated. Even the gods cannot do anything about it. They are instruments of fate. It's also mentioned in some legends, though in other legends it's otherwise, that Zeus knows fate, though he can do very little about it. In some legends, even Zeus is subject to fate, the god of gods. That's what we are watching even in the Shiva legend going on. That, Shiva says that even we, the Trinity, are subject to fate and determinism. We can't change it. We have to go through it. This is one line of thought. But in Indian thought, there is another line that fate can be changed. And Savitri legend that way is very, very significant. Because it is not the usual, it doesn't follow the usual kind of philosophies, Indian or Western or Greek or any other, but takes up a very different stand that fate can be changed. It's not common to find this. And yet it is true that fate can be changed. It doesn't mean that anyone can anytime change fate. But there is a secret. And that's what we are here to learn from Savitri. The third interesting aspect about Savitri is that it raises the right kind of questions. A lot of problems arise, we are not able to answer things because we raise the wrong kind of questions. It's an art to raise the right kind of questions. If we raise the right kind of questions, we may get the true answer. For instance, a very common question that people raise is that, why am I going through this problem? This is half a question. This question would have a meaning if, others were not going through problems, but everybody is going through problem. But see how Buddha raises this question. He doesn't say why one day I will fall ill or why have I fallen ill. He says why there is illness, why there is suffering, why there is old age, why there is death. Now this is a cosmic question. There is a way that every individual question can be raised to another level because the problem is not individual. And when we try to just solve it individually, we get only half solutions. And therefore the question has to be raised to another level. It's really a cosmic problem. Even when people come from a great plane of consciousness, they too go through same problems, old age, disease, suffering. So why there is suffering? Why this zone is like that? How has it happened that in a creation which has come out from the divine, actually either which way, the answer is not simple. People have tried to explain this creation. It's a big question. Not just our creation. To our creation, the answer is parents. But it's an absurd answer. So, the problem of creation, the question of creation, it's a big mystery, how it has come. So, there are two ways people have tried to answer, and both raise more questions. So, one is that there is nothing behind creation, it's an endless unrolling of nature. So, question is, how did it start? There is no answer. The second question is, there is God, there is a reality, and from there it all started. So then the question is, why it has started and what kind of creation is this? If the divine is truly infinite existence, infinite bliss, infinite consciousness, then why the creation is of just the opposite nature? It should reflect somewhere something like the divine. Maybe in some moments, exalted moments, people experience divinity, but by and large, one has to be really blind to say that no, things are very nice, wonderful, it's very divine. So, to try to answer this, the philosophers gave another answer that no, divine is wonderful, but in this creation, it's individual. He does evil, therefore he gets punishment. This raises many more questions, even more questions than the original one. Who impelled us to error and sin? And what is this machinery unrolling? There is a witness and there is this machinery. It's very difficult to reconcile it, though strangely Advaitins try to fit it forcibly. It's like, you have a picture bigger than the frame. So you try to fit it into the frame, you fold it, parts you cannot see, the mystery remains unsolved, and you say, no, you cut it to size and put it into the frame. That's how we try to do it. And thus far we have been satisfied with these answers. But I think the time has come when people raise uncomfortable questions with regard to scriptures and philosophies, and it's a very good sign. Sri Aurobindo spoke about it in one of his beautiful essays, Original Thinking. And he says that how India would recover its strength. It's in the context of India, but it applies everywhere, but more so in India. Because we have another kind of problem. In the other side of the globe, the problem is there are no traditions. So there is no anchoring, rooting. One is looking for anchors and rooting. But here we have too much of tradition. We have all the answers and we are very satisfied with the answers. This is dangerous because we don't raise fresh questions. And he says we have to recover the original thinking by once again raising the questions. And then he says we should be careful not to accept either the authority of Sayana or the authority of the Western thinkers. Both are dangerous. We have to raise these questions afresh. And some of these questions Sri Aurobindo raises through the lips of Queen. And that's why these questions are amazing. As far as I know, these questions have not been raised in any philosophical test. At least I have read most of them, and I used to have these questions, but they were not there, so they were not the answers. The answers were the standard stock answers. And here we have questions emerging from these answers. And that's why I use this word in Hindi, Sesh Prashna. When all the questions have been answered, there are questions which remain unanswered. And Sri Aurobindo raises them. And I have a feeling that Sri Aurobindo has raised these questions in the mind of the race. So now the youngsters are raising these questions, much like Krishna and Arjuna. Arjuna was not a philosophical person. But suddenly Krishna sows in him those questions because he has to give those answers. Somebody has to raise these questions. The mother in a conversation says that I throw these questions and I am waiting for you people to ask. But there were just few persons who would ask questions. Both among disciples of Sri Aurobindo and during the conversation, very few who would raise questions. And one of them is very interesting. Taradi was telling me that how when she would ask questions, her father once scolded her. It seems that you are the only stupid girl who is asking questions. Thanks to those questions, we have so many answers. Thanks to Nirodha's correspondence and Dilip Kumar Roy's correspondence that we have those answers. Otherwise we wouldn't have had. So even the questions are inspired by the Lord. And when we raise them, they are like keys. If we have the right question, they unlock a door in the spirit. And if you have the wrong question, we keep turning it, it doesn't really answer. So here we have some right questions. And it starts very beautifully, page 441. We are just going a little behind, just to cover up the background. Page 441. All is an episode in a meaningless tale. After a long background, the Queen says that it looks like everything here is a meaningless chain of cause and effect. All is an episode of a meaningless tale. Even if you say karma, if it's just a machinery, unfolding itself with no real issue and no real end, then it's a meaningless tale. But then the question is, why is it all and wherefore are we here? So if it is really a meaningless machinery, as is told, for instance in Buddhism, it's a meaningless machinery. It's a cause and effect, karma and its consequences. But itself, in itself, it has no real meaning. You can undo the story and weave the stars, you can pass into the silence of nirvana. But don't ask why this creation is there. But Queen raises this question, why is it all and wherefore are we here? Then she gives the answers and raises again fresh questions. If to some being of eternal bliss, it is our spirit's destiny to return. This is what we are told, that we come from that and we go to that. They are big philosophies. There's a beautiful book written by a famous yogi, I am that. We all know, Aham Brahmasmi, Tat Tvamasi, great truths. But at least I used to have this problem that, okay, if I am that, nothing in my life reflects that. Why is it so? It's a paradox. So she is raising this question. If to some being of eternal bliss, it is our spirit's destiny to return, or some still impersonal height of endless calm, since that we are, and out of that we came. So this is the answer given. So the Queen raises a fresh question. Whence rose the strange and sterile interlude, lasting in vain through interminable time? Why then the necessity? If we are that, why this whole drama of creation? Who planned it and willed it? Who willed to form or feign a universe? Either which way. If it's an illusion, well, this illusion looks so real. Who caught us? Who gave us this imperfect sight so that we believe the illusion as a reality? Who will to form or feign a universe in the cold and endless emptiness of space? Or if these beings must be and their brief lives, what need had the soul of ignorance and tears? Whence rose the call for sorrow and for pain? So there is an answer to this first part that, well, Eko Ham Bahushyami. He willed that the one wanted to be many. So it could have been many like in the Golok and the higher worlds. In the higher world there are many. And these many and the one are conscious. The many are conscious of the one. So there is no sorrow. These are griefless worlds. Sorrowless worlds of bliss. So he could have been many without this need for fall into this error, into this darkness, into this suffering. So this is the second part. That okay, one wanted to become the many. So the question is, then why? The need of ignorance and tears. We can have many and a beautiful play out of that. Or all came helplessly without a cause. What power forced the immortal spirit to birth? So the other answer is, don't raise this question. This question has no meaning. It is an endless rolling of creation. It's not an answer really. It's stating the obvious in another way. It's like saying, please don't ask. When children ask too many questions, the last answer of the teacher is shut up and keep quiet. You're asking too many questions. So it's like saying, don't ask this question. The universe is eternally unrolling itself. These are answers actually given in the spiritual philosophical books. So this doesn't solve the problem because still it remains, who caused it? Or all came helplessly without a cause. What power forced the immortal spirit to birth? The eternal witness once of eternity, a deathless sojourner mid transient scenes, he camps in life's half-lit obscurity amid the debris of his thoughts and dreams. Or who persuaded it to fall from bliss and forfeit its immortal privilege? So this is another answer which is given. The answer is that, well, Dwa Suparna, it's a very well-known quoted text. It raises another problem. So the answer is that there are two poises. It's not said it's two poises. There is the Ishvara and there is the Jiva. The Ishvara is the eternal witness, free from joy and sorrow in his own bliss. He lives on the higher branch of the tree. And the Jiva is the stupid fellow who is caught up in joy and sorrow. He is eating the fruit, enjoying the fruit, and also suffers the sorrow. It's one attempt to answer it. This is how it has been answered. That, since he wants to eat the fruit, he will suffer. It's almost like the biblical story. But here the fruit is differently put. In the Bible also, Adam and Eve are very happy so long as they don't want to eat the fruit. So the moment they eat the fruit, they fall. So here there is a bird eating the fruit and going through suffering and joy. But there is another status where there is no suffering, no this limited joy, but a state of peace and bliss. So, but this is again not an answer, because the whole thing is passed on to this poor bird. So, but this poor bird, if it is immortal spirit or it's the immortal soul, who has really asked her, or who compelled? Where did that snake came, and why was this snake allowed in paradise? This is the other problem, that why was this fellow allowed like a worm in the fruit, that you eat it and then you go through this state. Who laid on it the ceaseless will to live? Now this is amazing line. Some of Sri Aurobindo's lines are simply amazing. A wanderer in this beautiful, sorrowful world, and bear its load of joy and grief and love. This is an amazing line. Of course, every line is amazing. We have this tendency to call this world sorrowful. Asukham. Well, this is not quite true. There is in this world, if we take the balance, more joy for anyone. But sorrow strikes us very much because it's an anomaly. We don't expect sorrow in this world. Somehow it's an intuitive feeling that there should be no sorrow. So when sorrow comes, we raise questions. And that's why we want to live. There's always a hope for joy. There is from the smallest acts to everyday life. So he says, a wanderer in this beautiful, sorrowful world. And the second line is even more marvelous. And bear its load of joy and grief. This we have heard. But he adds, and love. Because of love, we don't want to leave this world. Of course, this love has taken the form of attachment. Nevertheless, even in ignorance, deep behind it is love. And this love ties us to creation and its fate. Because of love, we remain bound to it. And because we are bound to it, therefore we have to take the burden of fate. But it's amazing. Here love is not shown as something negative, but something which can be seen in both ways. And of course he will reveal its deeper sense. Or if no being watches the works of time, the scientists would say all this, there is no Ishvara, there is no being, it's nothing, it's just an constant moving, it's nature. Or if no being watches the works of time, what hard impersonal necessity compels the vain toil of brief living things? Even the avowed atheist who believes there is no God, there is no divine being, it's a hallucination of some fellows who are seized by crazy questions. Yet they have a will to live. If really there is nothing, if it is only dust, if it's chemicals, then the right approach should be that they should legalize heroin and go and take a shot and maybe find a quick exit, but they don't. They still have a will to live and to think and make this world a better place. So where does all this come from? Well, another answer is, all these questions have no meaning. They are born of an illusory consciousness. It's like, we watch the soap operas and then there are discussions. Why is this lady doing this? Why is the Bahu acting this way? Why is the Saas acting this way? So the answer is, oh, this director has told her, don't spend your thought on meaningless things. It's an illusory story, it's not a real story. Why are you asking these questions? It's an illusory story. If your mind is too much with these questions, just switch off the TV. That's the answer. This question has no meaning at all because no real question. They are doing whatever the director has asked them to do, the storyteller has told them to act, and it's a fancy. That's all. It's not reality. So this also is another answer that it's an illusion. There is no sorrow, suffering, all these are products of illusion. So if we go inside, there are, for instance, horror passages like they have in Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. There is a, where you enter into the horror place, horror zone. There is also one near Chennai, where you enter, step into the place and all kinds of things will start. Now the interesting part about it, it's an illusion, it's not true, and yet you react. The moment you step inside, there will be all kinds of voices, and despite knowing you are trapped in that, so it's don't raise question. Who made it? Why made it? Just step out. You have a choice. Just get out of it. you have entered into it, so you are going through it. It's amazing. It's about the power of mind, how it can really hook us onto something. So when we enter, we know it's an illusion. Try to remind that no, it's not real, not real, not real. And yet, when suddenly a hand comes right in front with a screeching noise, all the knowledge and thought fails. At that point of time, there is a shiver inside. Why it happens? Well, same thing with TV shows and cinema shows. If you don't like, come out of it. So this is another answer. But this creates another problem, another question. And that question is, but where then is the soul's security, its poise in this circling of unreal suns? So this is a question scientists are raising now. If the TV show is an illusion, who says that my real life show is not an illusion? And if my real life experience is an illusion, maybe even my experience of the gods and divine is an illusion. So he says, where is the soul's security? Or else it is a wanderer from its home. So this is the other answer. That no. Everything is not an illusion. There is a reality and somehow the soul has come here. Or else it is a wanderer from its home who strayed into a blind alley of time and chance. It's like entering into that horror show out of curiosity and finds no issue from a meaningless world. Or where begins and ends illusion's reign. Perhaps this soul we feel is only a dream, eternal self, a fiction, sensed in trance. So I don't think that these questions have ever been raised with such clarity and force. And these are the questions which people have and are going to have in time to come. These are the questions of the age. And they must be raised. We should not be satisfied with half answers because it means we are satisfied with half discoveries. Our quest is not enough. So here Sri Aurobindo raises the quest to another level, and that's something very beautiful in Savitri, that the standard answers that we find in all these sacred textbooks, for all their sacredness, cannot satisfy the spirit's sacred thirst. And that's why we see Savitri is unique, because it raises even the question of pain in a unique way. It takes all those answers which have been given so far and says they are not complete answers, they are half-hearted answers. So it raises the question to next level and of course takes it to its cosmic level. So Narada's answer proceeds along different lines, and we see that how step by step Sri Aurobindo takes us to the real problem. So first, of course, he answers the last bit that if all is an illusion, where is the soul's security? And he says that, well, Queen, there is a truth. It's the normal answer. It's covered with ignorance. And we have to, when we remove the ignorance, then we know the truth. Was then the sun a dream because there is night? Hidden in the mortal's heart, the eternal lives. He lives secret in the chamber of thy soul. So, first thing necessary to solve this problem, this question is, this is a practical question, it's not a philosophical question. And this has to be solved step by step. And the first step is to be free from the fundamental ignorance. Is there really a soul? Let's find it out. So, this is where Sri Aurobindo says that we cannot know it just by philosophizing. So, what stands between the real experience and the conception of it? Well, our own thoughts, our hopes, our desires, our wants, all these stand between the reality and us. So, why this is important? Because it changes the very approach towards the whole thing. A light shines there, nor pain nor grief can cross. A darkness stands between thyself and him. Thou canst not hear or feel the marvelous guest. Thou canst not see the beatific sun. O Queen, thy thought is a light of thy ignorance. Its ignorance raised to its highest point, and it's almost now ready for the real answer. Now it's very interesting in this answer that we see, oh, Sri Aurobindo is saying something which everybody has said, that there is a reality beyond. But as we proceed, we'll see that it's not just that, but something else. And that is the beautiful part. So first he says what stands between you and the divine. Thy mind's light hides from thee the eternal's thought. Next page, few lines below. That yes, there is an eternal, there is a truth, there is an immortality, but it's hidden because of our thoughts. We have to quieten our minds to know it. That means all the time, all the kinds of things that are going on, buzzing around, we have to learn to quiet it. Thy heart's hopes hide from thee the eternal's will. Earth's joys shut from thee the immortal's bliss. So these are the three conditions. So we have to make a choice. Either we continue in the whirl of these normal thoughts, hopes, feelings, little joys, and then we lose that bliss, that the real idea that built this world, and the divine love which is permeating everything. Or we go beyond the screen. Now this is a difficult proposition because we are stuck then, because it's not easy to rip apart the screen. And therefore now we see the beauty of Sri Aurobindo's answer. This is true Advaita in the highest sense. Thence rose the need of a dark intruding God, the world's dread teacher, the creator pain. Now why I say this is true Advaita? Because in traditional Advaita, pain and suffering is explained away by man's karma. So there is on one side the divine consciousness, pure, true, eternal, full of bliss. On the other side, the foolish mortal struggling with ignorance and error, and therefore as its consequence, pain. So, pain and everything belongs to that machinery. And now he has to do some kind of a yoga or means through which he can cross beyond this line into the one. So what was this? Then he will discover it's an illusion. Now this is one way of explaining. But then here Sri Aurobindo, in this Advaita, Sri Aurobindo passes the burden of pain also to the one. So what does he do? When human beings are in a comfort zone, which prevents us, we are surrounded by those thoughts, those hopes, those joys. So God, it calls pain a God. So this God is doing a very terrible task, but he has this task to do. And this task is to shake everybody from their comfort zone. And when he does shake people from their comfort zone, they are forced, compelled to seek something beyond their little life. So he is basically a nice guy. Only thing is his methods are not good. We don't like it. And that also Sri Aurobindo will say that yes, he also agrees with us that basically his methods are not good. But he has been given this task. It's a difficult task. To push people out of their comfort zone. This is his task, to be a spoilsport. But when he does it, he actually compels us to think afresh. You see, all of us live or grow up with certain conceptions about life. It's very unfortunate that we many times die with the same conceptions. And whose conceptions were there? Our parents. We were taught this is truth. Ask our parents, they were taught by our grandparents. And so on till we discover that our great 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 grandparents learnt it from somewhere, maybe our great ancestors. Now this is not not the way to really evolve. So he shakes us out. We are compelled. God is great, good, beautiful. We don't seek him. We just go to temple and pray and we believe it. So when life gives us pain, then we are compelled to raise this question afresh. So for some time we accept our karma, karma, karma. Then we look at our neighbor and we see this fellow is a real scoundrel. So we say, what bad karma have I done? Why am I suffering so much? He is not suffering so much. Then we are told past karmas. Unfortunately, most of us stop inquiring further. We just accept it, past karmas. But then it's not right. It raises fresh question. If I was a devil in past karma, because of which I am suffering, how come in this life I am basically a nice guy? And if this guy was a saint, because of which he is enjoying, how come this saint has undergone a radically opposite conversion and become a wicked man and yet reaping the fruits of his past life? So it raises many more questions which we should raise. We don't raise it. So Sri Aurobindo has to raise the questions for us. Where ignorance is, there suffering too must come. So suffering is basically, it turns the table. So normally we think that pleasure is a reward from God and pain is a punishment. But it may be the other way round. Maybe when God feels like rewarding us for our good deeds, he allows some pain. And maybe when we are going through all pleasure, maybe that, our time has not yet come to evolve. It changes the whole perspective. So when pleasure comes, we have to be very careful and conscious and vigilant. That is everything okay? Has God forgotten me? Am I moving on the right path? Everything is just right. It's not that it means this, but we have to think afresh. So this is one fresh line of thought. Thy grief is a cry of darkness to the light. So when grief comes, we should not be satisfied with half answers. For instance, when people are confronted with a challenge, let's say a disease. So half answer is given by doctors or philosophers. So doctors give an answer, take a painkiller, you will be fine. I also do the same thing. I have no other answer. Not different from other doctors. Dolo 650, morning and night after food, your pain will be gone. That's it. Philosophers gives other half answer. Well, as long as you are alive, some form of malady will be there. Bear with it, go to a doctor or endure it. This is another half answer. But what really is the real answer? To bring light into this very body, that pain becomes impossible. So people will say that's an impossibility. Don't raise such impossible answers. But impossibility is the beginning of a new possibility. So thy grief is a cry of darkness to the light. Unfortunately, we become very readily satisfied. Actually, people say we are dissatisfied. Actually, human beings are very easily satisfied. They should be more dissatisfied. It will help. But we get readily satisfied. We get satisfied with, little, the boons of Yama to Savitri. So she says, you go back, you will find another guy. So she says, no. She's not easily satisfied. She says, I want this guy, not some other guy. Now, this is a sign of a dissatisfaction. Yama also tells Nachiketa, go back, I'll give you a lot of cattle and kingdom and everything. This is easy satisfaction. But Nachiketa is not satisfied. He says, no, you will take them away again. So give me that, having which I will no more desire these things. So this is called real dissatisfaction. So Pain was the firstborn of inconscience, which was thy body's dumb original base. So all this, we read last time. And then this first movement ends with, pain is the hammer of the gods to break a dead resistance in the mortal's heart. His slow inertia is of living stone. If the heart were not forced to want and weep, his soul would have lain down content, at ease, and never thought to exceed the human start, and never learned to climb towards the sun. So, it's not karma, it's something very nice. He has a terrible task to do, but it's a good work that he does. And heart is made to sometime want and weep because it can find the truer thing, the truer solution. We can close with this story of Tulsi Das. So sometimes how pain can come in strange ways, and how a small little touch can open a totally new door through which if we go, we can pass into a new world. So Tulsi Das, as we know, he was like any other ordinary mortal, maybe a little worse or a little better depending on how we look at it. So he was madly in love with his wife. Nothing wrong with that. It's a good thing. So this fellow is madly in love, and once when she goes away to her parents' place, he just can't bear the separation. Those old time models, not like modern models, they say, okay, go for a few days, but anyways, we can call and mobile is there. So when she goes away, he is suffering because she is away. So one day she can't bear this pain. So he says, I will go unannounced and meet her. So that night he is so much overcome with love and passion that he crosses the river in spate. Ganges is in spate, and he crosses the near flood, danger water mark, because he's moved by so much of love and passion. See, it reaches that intensity. And he can't, it's too late by the time he has reached. It's not right to, come unannounced and suddenly father-in-law will be shocked to see a man all wet dripping his son-in-law and he say, I want to meet my wife. Maybe he'll engage in formalities. So he sees that there is a rope hanging through the window and he says, my golden opportunity, grace is with me. It has arranged all the circumstances, and climbs through the rope into her room. Very filmy style. He could have passed through like any other film hero. This was not a rope, to make it even more worse. It was actually a snake, it seems. So, as he goes into the room, and this lady, obviously she's in deep sleep, and the last thing she wants to know, she's in the comfort zone with her parents. And suddenly, he wakes her up and she sees this, my husband has come dripping, and what a way he has come. She is very angry. She says, what kind of a man are you? I don't like this kind of a thing. Whatever she would have said. And at the end she says, if half this love you had for God, you would have realized God. Now, this hits him because he really loved her. It's an amazing story where how human love reaches a point, a peak, and then suddenly is ready to change into love for the divine. This hits him hard. That here is a woman for whom I have done all this. And at the end of it, she has to tell me all these angry words. And Tulsi Das turns towards Bhakti of Rama. And that's the end of one life and the start of another, a beautiful start of another. It is said that his wife Ratnabali repented. Why did I speak such words? Because he never turned back after that. It's an amazing story, like the Buddha, but on a different note. And there are people who have written about her sorrow. But here is a changing point. So pain is the hammer of the gods. It was very painful. But this hammer was very interesting. Because sometimes we need real hammers, hard blows. This was a soft blow. But because his passions and love had reached a point, this little blow came like a very hard blow. So this is the second way that the hammer comes. This hammer may come as a real hard-hitting blow when we are entrenched in real darkness, or when we are ready, we have reached a high point. After all, it's not easy to love some human being in such a beautiful, amazing way. Then just a gentle blow and we can cross over to the other side. So we'll stop here and continue after a break. Tomorrow we'll have only one session because there is a play, but today we'll have another session after 10 minutes.